Saudi Arabia, among the world's wealthiest nations, faces frequent criticism for human rights violations. The country enforces severe punishments, including capital sentences and various forms of corporal punishment, as part of its legal framework. Understanding the regional laws and cultural contexts is crucial when discussing these penalties. In this video, we delve into the details of these punishments, aiming to offer a comprehensive perspective on the subject. Join us as we explore 15 of the worst punishments in Saudi Arabia. Number 15. Capital punishment. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia retains the death penalty as the ultimate punishment for crimes like murder, rape, drug smuggling, and repeated theft. Apostasy and homosexuality have also been capital offenses, although no executions for those have been carried out in recent times. Public beheadings by sword remain the standard method of execution. Between 2007 and 2020, Saudi Arabia executed over 700 people convicted for a range of charges, although execution rates have dropped noticeably in the past few years. Public executions were meant to act as deterrent displays, but are now avoided due to the increasing controversy surrounding them. While most Muslim nations prescribe capital punishment, Saudi Arabia has stood out for its high execution rates. Government officials justify the death penalty as sanctioned under Sharia principles for deterring the most dangerous crimes. However, human rights organizations have consistently highlighted fair trial concerns and disproportionate sentencing of foreign migrants in Saudi Arabia. Public beheadings are also seen as cruel, archaic spectacles that should have no place in modern societies. While reform is extremely challenging due to powerful conservative clerics staunchly defending capital punishment as Islamic law, some progress is visible. Recent years have seen substantive reforms ensuring the death penalty is no longer mandatory for certain crimes. Juvenile executions have been banned entirely. The scope for judges to exercise discretion in sparing convicts based on mitigating circumstances has also increased moderately. The kingdom also faces growing external scrutiny as its geopolitical ambitions necessitate engaging more substantively with global norms around civil rights. While religious orthodoxy prevents wholesale abolition, incremental policy changes reducing reliance on execution indicate Saudi Arabia no longer wishes to remain an outlier from international human rights standards. Number 14. Public lashing. The practice of imposing judicial corporal punishment in the form of public flogging has long been an integral part of Saudi Arabia's criminal justice system. Viewed as an effective deterrent and just retribution for moral transgressions under the kingdom's stringent interpretation of Sharia principles, offenses ranging from alcohol consumption, sexual misconduct, theft, and drug use to murder could be punished by lashes inflicted upon the bare back and limbs. Between 1980 and 2013, Saudi Arabia carried out an estimated 6,000 public flogging sentences at an average rate of over 500 annually, peaking in the 1990s. The number of lashes for each case varied from relatively mild sentences of 10 to 15 lashes for petty crimes to upwards of 5,000 lashes for the most severe offenses like murder. Administration of the lashes also differed based on whether the guilty was male or female. Women were typically flogged while fully clothed in a seated position and with lighter canes. But irrespective of such variations, human rights advocates have strongly condemned the fundamental cruelty, physical trauma, and lasting psychological damage that judicial corporal punishments invariably inflict. Medical examinations of flogging victims have revealed lash marks that cut deep into the skin and musculature, leaving permanent scarring and sometimes lifelong disabilities restricting movement and function. The acute pain during floggings has also been known to induce fainting spells, even before the full sentence is complete. The mental trauma of awaiting and undergoing public flogging has also been flagged, with psychological effects ranging from depression to suicidal tendencies. While continuing to defend judicial lashing and flogging as effective criminal deterrents sanctioned under Islamic law, Saudi officials have reduced the scope of such sentences in recent years following escalating global criticism. In 2020, Saudi Arabia's Human Rights Commission announced a formal ban on flogging as court-ordered punishment, although its on-ground implementation remains partial. Number 13. Amputation for theft. Saudi Arabia retains judicial amputation of hands or feet as a potential punishment for theft and robbery under the kingdom's strict imposition of Islamic Sharia law codes. Public amputations have sometimes been deliberately staged in the past as macabre deterrents against larceny and brigands. Although exceedingly rare today, it remains in the statute books as a controversial possibility. Based on a hardline interpretation of Quranic verses and hadith texts sanctioning amputation of limbs for theft, Saudi courts have ordered amputations of hands for theft and serial cross amputations of alternate hands and feet for repeated offenses. Between 2000 to 2015, around 45 individuals had limbs amputated as punishment before the practice was largely abandoned under international criticism. Government officials rationalize it as divinely prescribed punishment and a potent deterrent in a hyper-conservative kingdom that prizes stability above all. However, human rights groups worldwide have unequivocally condemned the practice as inhumane physical mutilation and a violation of bodily sanctity that has no place in modern justice systems. The medical costs and lifelong disability caused by amputations also run against rehabilitative goals. Moreover, questions remain regarding procedural propriety and fair trial standards in many cases where amputation sentences were handed out, especially to foreign migrant workers. The justice system's opacity and allegations of forced confessions raise doubts about the verdict's legitimacy. Mass amputations of alleged thieves' limbs invite parallels with medieval justice that modern societies seek to transcend. Number 12. Public executions. The imposition of capital punishments through public beheadings and firing squads represents one of the most visually impactful symbols of Saudi Arabia's justice system. While most crimes warranting the death penalty like murder, rape, or drug smuggling are conducted in prison yards, select executions have been deliberately staged in public squares to maximize their visibility and deterrent effect. Government authorities justify public executions as efficacious warnings that dissuade criminal or destabilizing acts by unambiguously demonstrating the violent consequences that await those guilty of capital offenses. The crowds gathered at execution sites are meant to internalize the severe penalties for grave sins like murder or terrorism. However, human rights groups have consistently called for ending public executions in the kingdom on ethical grounds. Beyond debates on capital punishment, conducting executions before audiences in marketplaces are seen as amplifying their cruelty. The humiliating spectacle of condemned individuals being beheaded before throngs is deemed inconsistent with human dignity. Public attendance also risks normalizing state-perpetrated violence as acceptable justice rather than an unfortunate last resort. Families are said to worry about the trauma, especially of minors, of witnessing gruesome beheadings drain the victims of blood. Reform advocates argue that hidden executions restricted to prison yards would fulfill any deterrence goals without the concerning public theater. While numbers have always fluctuated year to year, the long-term trend appears to be decreasing acceptance of public executions in Saudi society. Calls from civil society to restrict executions away from the public eye have grown louder over the past decade. The state too appears cognizant of global distaste at the practice of compromising its desired image as a modernizing nation. Number 11. Stoning for adultery. The medically horrific and cruel punishment of stoning to death retains a troubling legal standing in present-day Saudi Arabia as a potential penalty for the offense of adultery. While exceedingly rare in actual practice, several cases have emerged over the years of courts handing out death by stoning sentences to married men and women found guilty of the religious offense of illicit sexual relations. Per Saudi Arabia's stringent interpretation of Sharia law codes dealing with moral sexual transgressions, married persons judged guilty of adultery could face execution by public stoning. This entails burying the convict in a pit so that only the head remains above ground, and then bombarding the trapped body with stones thrown by crowds until battered to death. The number of stones and size required to be sufficiently fatal are even specified in some manuals. Number 10. Punishment for apostasy. The act of apostasy, construed as abandonment of religious belief, continues to constitute a criminal offense under Saudi Arabia's strict Islamic laws. Saudi authorities have historically punished apostasy with severe penalties under the premise that departure from Islam poses a threat to national identity and societal cohesion in the deeply devout kingdom. While the death penalty for apostasy has become exceedingly rare in recent times, other harsh sentences like public flogging or long imprisonment remain in place for convicted apostates. Rights groups repeatedly emphasize that punishing individuals for freely choosing or renouncing religious beliefs contravenes modern global norms and violates constitutionally guaranteed freedoms of conscience. However, Saudi officials defend anti-apostasy laws as vital for preserving Islamic values and unity in the birthplace of Islam. Allowing visible conversion away from Islam or the spread of atheist thought is seen as undermining the kingdom's foundations. However, critics counter that truly resilient societies do not need to criminalize thought or belief differently. They assert the need for Wahhabi institutions to evolve more tolerance. Although conditions enabling complete religious freedom remain afar currently, incremental reforms have been emerging. Shiite minorities have been allowed greater space to practice their faith openly in recent years. There are also growing public calls for permitting non-Muslims to practice their faith privately, including from within the royal house itself. While hardliners resist rapid change, pragmatists acknowledge that integration with an increasingly pluralistic world requires relaxing insularity and allowing citizens more autonomy in their spiritual choices. With globalization eroding possibilities of thought control like before, accepting diversity may be the more sustainable way forward. Number 9. Punishment for homosexual acts. Saudi Arabia employs harsh punitive measures, including imprisonment, corporal punishments, and even execution for individuals accused and convicted of homosexual acts and relations, which are strictly prohibited under the nation's conservative Islamic laws. Consensual same-sex relations are classified as adultery under Sharia, while penetrative acts between men fall under the broader prohibition of sodomy, incurring severe penalties for contravening moral codes. While convictions for homosexuality culminating in capital punishment, lesser sanctions like lashes and jail terms are commonly administered. The criminalization of homosexuality has drawn strong condemnation from human rights bodies worldwide for enabling stark persecution against sexual minorities. They assert that the brutal, disproportionate punishments violate the inherent human rights to privacy, dignity, health, and freedom from violence that all individuals are equally entitled to. The ill treatment and denial of rights to LGBTQ+ citizens fosters an environment of fear, oppression, and injustice. It denies them autonomy over intimate life choices that are fundamental to a fulfilled human existence. The mental toll and inner turmoil triggered by social stigma and draconian laws leave many secretly struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Beyond principles, experts argue that persecuting homosexuality is also irrational and futile, as it has existed across eras and cultures. Moreover, the arbitrary nature of charges and ensuing closed trials with forced confessions raises grave concerns over procedural fairness and just enforcement. The UN has called on Saudi Arabia to decriminalize same-sex relations and safeguard LGBTQ rights. While religious orthodoxy poses barriers currently, the rising global tide of LGBTQ+ equality has amplified calls for tolerance domestically too. As Saudi society slowly modernizes, progressive voices express hope that future reforms would decriminalize consensual same-sex relations and make Sogi-esque rights discussions less taboo. Number 8. Punishment for witchcraft and sorcery. Saudi Arabia stands alone even among Muslim-majority nations today in continuing to criminalize and harshly punish acts of alleged witchcraft and sorcery under its religious law codes. While other Islamic countries have abolished spiritual charlatanism statutes with modernization, Saudi laws still sanction punishments like imprisonment, lashings, and even execution for supposed magical or occult practices. The kingdom's religious vigilantes and clerical courts often receive reports from ordinary citizens accusing their neighbors, rivals, or associates of dubious activities like spellcasting, fortune-telling, producing charms and talismans, or offering magical healing services. If investigations corroborate such mystical crimes, the accused can face years-long incarceration or painful public lashings. Rare cases have also witnessed condemned individuals being beheaded for the nebulous crime of witchcraft. Rights groups have strenuously objected to the irrationality in criminalizing imaginary acts and punishing devotees of magic or mysticism in this day and age. The UN has called on Saudi Arabia to cease the terribly unjust persecution of atheists and faith minorities through vague witchcraft charges. However, belief in sorcerers and talismans remains deeply ingrained in the public psyche, often actively encouraged by clerical authorities. Officials defend crackdowns on spiritual fraud by arguing that exploitative conmen must be deterred. But skeptical activists highlight how accusations frequently arise from personal feuds and are informed by fear-mongering, necessitating more rationality. While reversing long-held irrational beliefs in the supernatural requires generational change, critics urge more immediate legal reforms to halt abuses enabled by these ambiguous statutes. Ensuring fair trials, preventing torture for confessions, and limiting punishments to proportionate terms could help curb the worst excesses. Sustained awareness campaigns promoting scientific literacy and critical faculties are also advocated. Number 7. Criminalizing atheism. The act of atheism remains a criminal offense in Saudi Arabia under laws that prohibit renouncing or criticizing core tenets of Islam, which forms the bedrock of the kingdom's identity as the birthplace of Islamic faith. Atheism is construed as a challenge to Saudi Arabia's foundational Islamic character that could potentially undermine social cohesion and order. The 2014 terrorism law categorizes calling for atheist thought as an offense punishable by lengthy imprisonment, although death sentences have become rare. Additionally, numerous other laws like those against blasphemy or apostasy also deter atheist expression and promote religious homogeneity. The climate of fear and deterrence stifles any discussions interrogating or critiquing religious doctrine. Rights groups have unanimously condemned the criminalization of atheism as it violates the basic human right to freedom of conscience, thought, and belief. From a human rights perspective, non-belief or heterodox views cannot be criminalized regardless of cultural traditions. Amnesty International has advocated for removing all provisions that punish atheism and urged Saudi Arabia to uphold free thought. However, officials argue that safeguarding Islamic values from erosion takes priority in the kingdom. But critics counter that sustaining an open, vibrant society demands embracing pluralism beyond suppressing unorthodox ideas. They recommend initiating reforms to allow respectful discussions assessing aspects of religious thought instead of reflexive punishment. Number 6. Discriminatory punishments for women. Saudi Arabia's justice system has been criticized over the decades for incorporating harshly discriminatory and disproportionate punishments targeted specifically at women. From public lashings for indecent, unsanctioned mingling to imprisonment for disobeying male authority figures, these punitive practices reflected the patriarchal attitudes and gender double standards deeply ingrained in the conservative kingdom. Powerful clerical courts wielded authority over nearly every facet of women's lives, with the aim of enforcing female compliance with tribal customs, masquerading as religious mandates. Restraining women's freedoms and autonomy through threats of severe penalties for nonconformity remained the modus operandi for maintaining male hierarchical privileges in a rapidly modernizing society where old norms were being challenged. Human rights bodies within Saudi Arabia and internationally condemned the systemic injustices enabled by gender-biased punishments rooted not in Islam, but in misogynistic cultural interpretations. They emphasized how hindering half the population's participation in socio-economic life also gravely impeded the nation's development, besides violating equality. However, recent decades have witnessed significant reforms driven by a combination of amplified advocacy efforts, evolving cultural attitudes, and pragmatic compulsions. Reduced male control over spheres like education, employment, public presence, and foreign travel has expanded women's horizons beyond the domestic space. With greater personal freedoms have also come gradual relief from the constant threat of harsh punishment over minor transgressions. While gender-based violence remains a problem requiring more stringent responses, its social acceptability has diminished amidst changing mindsets. Rights groups acknowledge substantive improvement in women's position, exemplified by policies like curtailing the silencing male guardianship system. However, they continue to emphasize that lasting equality requires not just policy reforms, but fundamentally transforming chauvinistic social attitudes and ingrained cognitive biases. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. The individual tasked with conducting public beheadings in Saudi Arabia is referred to as a jalad. Among the notable executioners in the country is Mohammed Saad al-Beshi, who has carried out over 800 beheadings since 1998. Sadly, Saudi Arabia has a troubling history of imposing the death penalty on minors, exemplified by cases like Abdullah al-Hawaiti, who at 14 years old was arrested, tortured, and coerced into confessing to a crime he could not have committed. Shockingly, he was still a minor when sentenced to death. Despite Saudi Arabia's publicized intent to abolish the death penalty for crimes committed during minority, at least 15 child defendants, accused of offenses during their youth, have been executed since 2013. Share your thoughts on Saudi Arabia's laws in the comments below. Number 5. Punishment for blasphemy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia administers harsh punishments like prolonged imprisonment, painful lashes, and even the death penalty for acts of blasphemy that show irreverence for God, the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, or Islamic beliefs. Safeguarding the sanctity of religion is viewed as essential in the deeply devout Muslim nation. The blasphemy laws cover a broad range of acts, speech, or expressions that could be deemed insulting to sacred Islamic figures, texts, or customs. Punitive action is also taken against apostasy, atheist thought, or alternate faith practices under the pretext of upholding religious integrity. The laws have stifled progressive Islamic discourse. Rights groups have highlighted how such restrictions contravene international rights protections for freedom of expression, thought, and religion that Saudi Arabia is also obligated to uphold. The UN has noted that imprisoning individuals for questioning or critiquing religious orthodoxy cannot be justified on grounds of combating religious hatred. Moreover, the arbitrary scope of what constitutes blasphemy leaves it vulnerable to misuse for personal retribution, or to penalize religious minorities, dissenters, and reformists seeking to debate matters of faith. Trials under blasphemy charges are also alleged to be procedurally flawed, relying heavily on coerced testimonies and forced confessions. However, the government contends punishments are warranted to prevent the destabilizing spread of sacrilegious, immoral, and dissenting rhetoric that could weaken Islamic faith and values in Saudi society. While reforms currently seem unlikely due to conservative clerical resistance, gradual change could emerge if moderate sections gain policy influence. With modernization and integration with the outside world, intolerant attitudes and draconian controls become harder to sustain. While blasphemy laws are specific to Saudi Arabia currently, optimists hope that a future societal shift, focused on ethics over dogma, may eventually enable their reform or repeal as the nation catches up with global human rights standards. Number 4. Punishment for drug trafficking. Saudi Arabia implements some of the world's strictest narcotics laws, mandating severe criminal penalties for drug trafficking, including potential capital punishment, as part of its uncompromising prohibitionist approach to narcotic control. The country's sensitive geographical location, neighboring unstable regions, sees it face major cross-border drug smuggling challenges. In response, Saudi law and enforcement adopted an iron-fisted strategy prioritizing combating drug cartels and interdiction efforts through draconian deterrence punishments and intensive surveillance. Possession or dealing of banned substances like heroin, cocaine, and cannabis invites steep punishments like flogging, years to decades in prison along heavy fines. Capital punishment also remains in place for large-scale traffickers and repeat offenders as the harshest sentence. Officials defend this strict stance as necessary, given the existential threat posed by transnational drug mafias to public health and social stability. Preventive detention without trial for suspected dealers is also commonly practiced. However, human rights groups and advocates argue that the harshness has not meaningfully dented drug smuggling or abuse, while mostly just packed prisons with small-time users, dealers, and drug mules. With rehabilitation and treatment remaining scarce, the system creates cycles of recidivism. Moreover, opaque trial processes and allegations of forced confessions raise rights concerns. There are also calls to consider decriminalizing personal use and to facilitate harm reduction services. Recognizing substance dependence as a public health issue necessitating empathy rather than punitiveness is advocated. The UN and other bodies have advised Saudi Arabia to implement reforms introducing gradations between serious traffickers versus those selling small quantities to support personal addiction. While religious sensitivities prevent rapid liberalization, sustained dialogue and exposure to global best practices focused on welfare over punishment provide hope for modest reform in the long run. With pragmatism ascending in Saudi policymaking, a softened and rebalanced narcotics criminal justice approach, better serving societal interests, could emerge gradually over the upcoming decades. Number 3. Punishment for treason. The act of treason, construed as a betrayal of the Saudi state through seditious plotting or espionage, faces stringent punitive action ranging from lengthy jail terms to execution. Protecting national security and the monarchy from internal and external threats is a paramount priority that overrides other considerations. Harsh sentences are rationalized as necessary to deter actions that could destabilize society and jeopardize Saudi sovereignty and internal order. Charges of treason are also applied to dissidents, reformists, and activists seen as overstepping red lines in criticizing government policies or royal authority. Allegations of regionally destabilizing interference have been invoked to justify crackdowns on opposition figures. However, human rights watchdogs have consistently flagged serious procedural concerns and violations in Saudi Arabia's handling of treason trials and sentencing. Defendants frequently lack proper legal aid and contact with relatives. Forced confessions extracted under torture or duress are often relied upon for convictions in secrecy-shrouded trials. Executions of political opponents after rushed trials with no independent scrutiny have drawn global criticism for Saudi Arabia. While treason warrants stern action, states are obligated to ensure due process, rule of law, and human rights even for the accused, so that national security powers are not abused through arbitrary punishment. Reforms are needed to align Saudi practices with international justice standards. The UN has advised instituting transparency, accountability, and appeals processes as safeguards against potential excesses like disproportionate sentencing. With the world watching closely, advocates hope that Saudi Arabia will take gradual steps in reforming and professionalizing judicial treatment of accused traitors and political prisoners in line with the nation's ambitions to be seen as a modern, right-abiding state. While progress may seem unlikely presently, rising integration with the outside world is expected to increase pressure for reforms. With pragmatism ascending in Saudi governance, implementing judicial reforms that balance security imperatives with ideals of justice and ethics could be envisioned as a possibility in the kingdom sometime in the future. Number 2. Unlawful detention and torture. Multiple reports over the years by human rights organizations have highlighted the disturbing prevalence of illegal detention practices and incidents of torture against suspects during custody and interrogation by Saudi security agencies. These constitute grave violations of international rights prohibitions, as well as Saudi domestic laws prohibiting torture and mistreatment of prisoners. Individuals arrested on alleged terrorism or national security threats are frequently held incommunicado for extended periods without prompt access to legal counsel or contact with relatives as required, enabling violations with impunity. Former detainees have provided chilling accounts of being subjected to harsh torture like beatings, electric shocks, sleep deprivation, whipping of feet, and isolation aimed at coercing confessions and obedience. Authorities have justified such actions at times by claiming enhanced interrogation is needed when confronting threats like extremist militancy. However, human rights bodies categorically condemn any circumvention of rule of law processes and compromise the physical or mental integrity of detainees under any pretext. Resorting to unlawful secret detentions, forced confessions through torture, and lack of accountability mechanisms corrodes public trust and tarnishes state legitimacy. Under increasing scrutiny, Saudi Arabia has recently undertaken some nominal measures, like officially registering arrest details and allowing monitored family visits. However, human rights groups emphasize that effecting genuine change necessitates robust, systemic reforms ensuring transparency, accountability, and rights protections are institutionally guaranteed for all detainees, regardless of alleged crimes. While reversing long-entrenched unlawful practices within the security apparatus poses challenges, pressure is growing for meaningful action through legal reform and demilitarization. Despite limited progress so far, advocates are cautiously hopeful that exposure to global rights norms reforms and incentives for economic modernization may gradually impel Saudi Arabia to reform detention policies in alignment with international law against arbitrary arrest, secret detentions, torture, and rights violations, thereby fulfilling its human rights obligations. Number 1. Criminalization of dissent and activism. Saudi Arabia has faced escalating criticism in recent years over its intensifying crackdown and punitive treatment of dissidents, activists, reformists, and opposition voices. Using expansive definitions, authorities have classified even peaceful criticism and dissent as criminal offenses warranting harsh reprisals under terrorism and anti-sedition laws, earning rebukes from human rights bodies. Punishments to muzzle free speech and activism range from fines and travel restrictions to lengthy jail terms and corporal punishment. Capital punishment also remains instituted for non-violent actions deemed threatening to the state and monarchy. The scope and intensity of suppression have alarmed observers, as even mild questioning is met with disproportionate imprisonment, ways constructive dialogue is avoided. From women's rights activists and reformist writers to economists recommending fiscal changes and religious scholars challenging dogma, suppression now encompasses all sections raising voices, demanding greater freedoms and participation. The regime no longer tolerates any dissent that could even remotely threaten absolute royal authority. The crackdown also extends online to social media platforms. Saudi netizens and bloggers advocating reforms or critiquing state policies on platforms like Twitter have faced arrest and long jail sentences, forcing many into self-censorship. All dissent is being coerced into silence through fear and punitive deterrence. Rights groups emphasize that sustainable stability arises from inclusive governance, not repression of peaceful criticism. Stifling public discourse and participation only fosters resentment that could erupt later. They assert the urgent need for measured democratization, allowing non-violent activism and pluralistic civil society growth while rolling back abusive security powers, lack of transparency, and zero accountability. However, such reforms currently face resistance from intransigent clerical and security elements averse to ceding unchecked control. But pragmatic sections do acknowledge that social pressures for representation cannot be suppressed endlessly without consequences. With the global gaze fixed on Saudi Arabia's rights record, the dawn of a more inclusive political environment, willing to engage dissent through dialogue instead of punishment, cannot be ruled out in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.